The mind is often like a quiet landscape, shaping our experience in subtle ways we rarely notice. It forms quiet narratives beneath our awareness, gently influencing how we see, feel, and respond to the world around us. The ancient Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, understood this inner terrain well. They observed that our deepest struggles are not always about what happens to us, but how we interpret what happens. Life, in their view, was not defined by external chaos, but by the meaning the mind gives to it. They didn't look outward in search of control. They turned inward in search of clarity. Not to escape the world, but to better understand how their thoughts and perceptions shaped their experience of it. That insight still holds weight today. In a time of constant distraction and relentless noise, many of us search for peace by rearranging the world outside. We chase certainty, comfort, or control, believing that if we just fix our circumstances, our minds will follow. But the Stoics offered a quieter path, one that begins by examining the lens through which we view reality. They believed that emotional disturbance doesn't come from events themselves, but from the meaning we attach to them. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself often, "External things cannot touch the soul unless the soul allows it. Their power lies not in the event, but in our response." Seneca, in his Reflections, noticed how much of our suffering is borrowed from the imagination, from fears that never arrive, or concerns that never become real. He understood that many of our struggles are not born of the present, but of how we mentally rehearse what might go wrong. In the end, the Stoic lesson is simple but not easy. Peace begins not in perfecting the world, but in learning how to see it more clearly. When examined closely, many of our fears dissolve into something far less threatening than they first appeared. Seneca did not advocate for the suppression of fear or doubt. He encouraged thoughtful observation. He saw how easily the mind can turn uncertainty into imagined danger, how quickly perception can inflate shadows into threats. To him, discipline didn't mean harshness. It meant discernment, the ability to recognize the difference between real dangers and the anxieties we invent. A disciplined mind, in his view, was one that could gently guide itself back to clarity when it began to drift into confusion or distortion. Epictetus, who endured the harsh realities of slavery early in life, deepened this understanding. He knew from experience that the outer world, no matter how difficult, holds only limited power over us. What matters most is the response shaped within. He saw freedom not as something granted by circumstance, but as something cultivated in the mind. It was an inner condition, achieved through patience, reflection, and careful attention to the stories we tell ourselves. For Epictetus, the mind could be a place of liberation or a quiet prison, and the difference lay in how we chose to interpret our experience. He didn't call for resistance born of force, but for awareness born of honesty. A clear seeing of how our internal perspectives shape every part of life. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were then. Modern life presents a steady stream of choices, changes, and uncertainty. Each moment, each situation silently calls for a response. The Stoics remind us, stability is not about mastering the external world, but about meeting each moment with a grounded awareness of what arises within. Marcus Aurelius practiced this daily. He returned again and again to reflection, watching his inner dialogue, observing how his thoughts shaped his emotions, and how the mind, left unchecked, could quietly shape the course of a life. He understood something essential. Life's uncertainties are unavoidable. But even amid the unknown, clarity and calm remain available, quietly, patiently, through disciplined attention to the inner world. For the Stoics, mastering the mind was never about control in the rigid sense. It wasn't about suppressing emotion or silencing doubt. It was about observing carefully, discerning thoughtfully, and gently guiding the inner narrative. Emotional steadiness was not seen as a fixed state to be achieved, but as a continual practice, something lived, refined, and deepened over time. Marcus Aurelius described this kind of inner steadiness as a refuge, an internal place of calm that remained intact even when the world around him shifted. He understood that peace was not something to be found in the external, but something that arises from within, cultivated through honest reflection and quiet persistence. The Stoics did not offer final answers. They didn't hand down rigid doctrines. Instead, they extended an invitation toward deeper understanding, toward a life shaped not by reaction, but by intention. They reminded us that the quality of our experience is shaped far more by our interpretations than by the events themselves. That clarity doesn't come from controlling the world, but from learning to see it more clearly and to respond to it more wisely. This philosophy doesn't ask us to turn away from life's difficulties, but to meet them with presence, to observe rather than assume, to reflect before reacting, to choose with care. In this practice, there is a quiet form of strength, not loud, not forceful, but steady. And in that steadiness lies something rare, a sense of stability that doesn't depend on the world being predictable, but on our willingness to engage it with clarity. There's a natural impulse to seek the cause of our struggles outside ourselves, in circumstances, in people, in things we can't control. It feels easier that way, more comforting at first. But the Stoics, through careful observation, turned inward, not to escape life, but to meet it more honestly. In his reflections, Marcus Aurelius observed something quietly profound. Despite the weight of ruling an empire, he rarely placed the cause of his anxieties or frustrations on the world around him. Instead, he turned inward, consistently examining the ways his own mind shaped his experience. He recognized a simple but powerful truth. The world itself holds no inherent power to harm or uplift. It is our interpretation, our inner narrative, that gives events their emotional weight. Whether something feels overwhelming or manageable, meaningful or trivial, depends less on the event itself and more on how we understand it. Seneca echoed this insight. He noticed how often suffering arises not from reality, but from the stories we tell ourselves about it. A minor inconvenience, a brief misunderstanding, things that are insignificant in isolation, can become sources of prolonged distress when filtered through an unchecked mind. He urged a slower, more thoughtful approach, to pause and observe rather than react, to recognize that our emotional turmoil often comes not from what happens, but from the meaning we assign to what happens. His guidance was not harsh discipline, but patient awareness, an encouragement to look inward before casting blame outward. Epictetus, shaped by the hardships of slavery and personal loss, knew this truth from experience. He understood that external adversity, no matter how severe, could not define his inner life without his consent. Freedom, for him, was not found in changing circumstances, but in mastering perception. He saw that an undisciplined mind, left unchecked, could become its own prison. A prison built not of walls, but of fear, resentment, and imagined inadequacies. His answer was not control through force, but clarity through reflection. A steady practice of examining internal narratives, gently untangling the distortions that give suffering its strength. Today, in a world of rapid change and constant pressure, these ancient insights still hold their ground. We often search for relief in external solutions, thinking if we can just fix the world around us, the mind will follow. But the Stoics pointed us in a different direction. They reminded us, the root of peace or distress, freedom or suffering, lies not in what happens, but in how we meet what happens. Not in the noise around us, but in the stillness we're willing to cultivate within. We often believe that inner peace must wait, waiting for circumstances to improve, for problems to resolve, for the world around us to settle. But the Stoics saw it differently. They observed that true clarity doesn't arise from external conditions alone. It begins within, through quiet, consistent attention to how we interpret and respond to what happens around us. Marcus Aurelius made this a daily practice. He reflected patiently, observing how each thought and perception shaped his emotional state. He understood that even in the midst of chaos, the power to respond with calm and clarity remained within reach. The Stoics never suggested that we ignore reality or suppress our emotions. Instead, they encouraged a more honest and steady approach, one of continuous observation. They asked us to pay close attention to the quiet stories the mind constructs around each experience, and to question whether those stories help or hinder our ability to live well. At the heart of this practice is discernment, the ability to recognize the difference between what is happening and how we're interpreting it, between the event itself and our internal reaction to it. And in that space, in that pause between stimulus and response, we find choice. The choice to respond intentionally rather than react impulsively. The choice to shape our experience with care rather than be shaped by it. The Stoics remind us that life's greatest challenges are not just outside of us, but within. Circumstances will change. They will rise and fall, often beyond our control. But the capacity to meet those changes with calm, with clarity, and with self-awareness that is always available. It begins with observation. Quiet, patient, steady. And in that practice, we begin to find something rare. Peace that does not depend on the world being peaceful. Through careful attention to our internal narratives, a lasting kind of stability begins to emerge, an inner steadiness that remains largely untouched by the shifting world around us. This quiet strength is not dramatic or forceful. It's subtle, and it becomes accessible through honest, ongoing self-awareness. The mind, the Stoics observed, holds a unique power. It can serve as our greatest ally or quietly become our most persistent obstacle, shaping the texture of our experience, often without our full awareness. Marcus Aurelius understood this not just in theory, but through lived reflection. Amid the pressures of leadership, he turned inward, not to escape responsibility, but to better meet it. He noticed how unattended thoughts could subtly shape his emotions and actions, either bringing clarity or distorting perception. In his private writings, he returned again and again to this truth, that his inner dialogue played a more decisive role in his life than anything happening around him. Seneca shared a similar insight. He saw how easily the mind could inflate a small frustration into a lasting disturbance, not because the event itself held great weight, but because of the meaning applied to it. He understood that the mind constructs either walls or windows, depending on how we interpret our experience. And rather than urge suppression or control, he encouraged observation, reminding us that when the mind is guided patiently, it often finds its way back to clarity on its own. Epictetus, shaped by deep personal adversity, expanded this perspective even further. He saw clearly how internal narratives, fueled by imagined failure, doubt, or inadequacy, could quietly undermine even the most favorable conditions. What he taught was not to resist or silence these thoughts, but to meet them with honest attention, to distinguish between what is real and what is merely imagined, between the true limits we face and the ones we've unknowingly accepted. For Epictetus, true strength was never about force. It was about clarity, a kind of inner resilience formed not by pushing thoughts away, but by patiently reshaping the story we tell ourselves, until it supports our growth rather than hinders it. And this is what the Stoics ultimately offer, not rigid answers, but a path of inward attention, a reminder that the mind, when gently and consistently examined, becomes a place of refuge, not because life becomes easier, but because we become steadier. This understanding remains deeply relevant in the rhythm of modern life, where the mind is often pulled in many directions, distracted by noise, burdened by anxiety, and weighed down by competing demands. In such an environment, it's easy for internal dialogue to quietly distort perception, amplifying uncertainty and slowly eroding confidence. Yet the Stoics remind us, clarity doesn't come through force. It arises through quiet, thoughtful awareness. Marcus Aurelius lived this principle. Through daily reflection, he practiced a gentle form of discipline, patiently observing how his thoughts shaped his emotional state. He paid close attention to the moments when his mind drifted into exaggeration or unhelpful patterns, choosing instead to return to a calmer, more grounded perspective. For the Stoics, discipline of the mind was never about harsh control or emotional suppression. It was a practice of awareness, of recognizing mental habits, noticing inner tendencies, and gradually guiding the mind toward clarity rather than confusion. Seneca echoed this approach. He emphasized discernment over reaction and reflection over resistance. To him, emotional steadiness was not a destination, but a practice, something continually refined through self-awareness and thoughtful observation. It wasn't about becoming unaffected, but about becoming more aligned with what is real and less entangled with what is imagined. Ultimately, the Stoics did not define mastery of the mind as domination, but as understanding, a kind of inner clarity that grows not through force, but through presence. They recognize that each thought, each internal narrative, quietly shapes perception, influencing how we feel and how we move through the world. And when we begin to observe those thoughts with care, without judgment, something begins to shift. The mind becomes clearer, the noise softens, fear loses its grip. This is not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet, ongoing invitation, a daily return to awareness. Through this steady internal discipline, we gain something subtle yet powerful, the ability to shape our experience not by controlling the world, but by clarifying the lens through which we see it. Through steady awareness, the mind can be gently transformed, from a source of resistance into a trusted ally. Fear, the Stoics observed, often lives not in the present moment, but in the imagination. It projects possibilities, paints vivid outcomes, and builds scenarios that often feel far more overwhelming than what reality ever delivers. Marcus Aurelius noticed this within himself. In his private reflections, he observed that many of the troubles he feared in advance never unfolded the way his mind had predicted. His insight wasn't to deny fear or ignore real concerns. It was to recognize how easily the mind can take uncertainty and shape it into something larger, something heavier than it needs to be. By watching these mental constructions with patience, Marcus didn't suppress his anxiety. He softened its grip. He found clarity not by controlling emotion, but by gently separating what was imagined from what was real. Seneca reached a similar understanding. He saw that anxiety often arises not from events themselves, but from the mind's tendency to anticipate the worst. A minor doubt, left unchecked, could quickly grow into a looming catastrophe, fueled not by fact, but by assumption. His response was not impulsive control, but thoughtful reflection. He encouraged the slow, steady examination of fear, asking whether these imagined outcomes truly held weight. And in doing so, he discovered something simple. Many fears dissolve when seen clearly. Epictetus, shaped by personal hardship, knew fear from experience. And yet he too came to understand that much of what we fear is rooted in imagined outcomes, not in present conditions. Even in difficulty, he observed how fear grows through anticipation, how the mind, left unexamined, can quietly turn uncertainty into something paralyzing. His approach was patient, not to fight fear with force, but to meet it with honesty, to notice how the mind exaggerates, to question its assumptions gently, and to guide it back toward a more grounded view. This insight continues to speak clearly to modern life. We live in a world filled with uncertainties, career pressure, shifting relationships, social expectations, and the constant noise of change. These create fertile ground for anxiety, often long before anything has gone wrong. But the Stoics remind us, fear is often a story, not a fact. And when we take the time to observe it, not with resistance, but with curiosity, we begin to see through it. We begin to notice that many fears, once examined, begin to fade. Not because life is suddenly certain, but because we're no longer reacting to imagination. We're responding to reality with calm and care. Marcus Aurelius made internal reflection a regular practice. When fears arose, he did not immediately accept them as truth. Instead, he paused. He looked closely at each anxious thought, patiently asking whether it reflected reality or simply the mind's reaction to uncertainty. More often than not, he discovered that what first appeared threatening, upon closer examination, held far less weight. Seneca approached fear in a similar way. He did not treat it as something to be forcefully eliminated, but something to be gently questioned. He encouraged a calm self-awareness, an honest inquiry into whether our anxieties are grounded in real concerns or fueled by the imagination. The Stoics never promised a life free of fear. What they offered was something more lasting, a way of understanding fear rather than being ruled by it. They recognized anxiety as a natural part of being human, but natural doesn't mean uncontrollable. Through consistent observation, they found that many fears, once brought into the light, begin to lose their intensity. Epictetus saw this clearly. He understood that fear, when examined with patience, gradually softens. It doesn't need to be forced away. It fades on its own when its imagined roots are seen for what they are. For him, resilience wasn't about external certainty. It was about internal clarity, the kind that comes from seeing the mind's patterns clearly without judgment. In the end, fear loses much of its power, not through resistance, but through awareness. The Stoics remind us, anxiety may be inevitable, but it rarely reflects the full truth of our situation. And when we observe it, quietly, steadily, it becomes less persuasive. We begin to see what's real and what is only imagined. This kind of internal discipline doesn't remove all fear, but it offers something deeper, a quiet, enduring form of self-understanding, a way to meet uncertainty, not with panic, but with presence. Doubt, too, has a quiet influence. It often moves beneath the surface, shaping choices with subtle pressure. Marcus Aurelius understood how hesitation, though it may seem harmless at first, can slowly restrict possibility. Left unexamined, it narrows our sense of direction until opportunities quietly disappear. He reflected often on this truth, that while uncertainty is a part of life, continuous hesitation often carries greater cost than thoughtful action. Even imperfect steps, taken with care, tend to leave fewer regrets than a life paused in indecision. Seneca saw the same pattern. He recognized the value of careful thought, but also the danger of becoming trapped in it. Decisions delayed too long can quietly close doors that may not open again. Both thinkers gently remind us, it is not certainty that we need in every moment, but the willingness to move forward with clarity, guided by intention rather than stalled by fear. Opportunities are often brief. They rarely wait for perfect clarity. Seneca understood this well. While he valued thoughtful reflection, he cautioned against hesitation stretched into paralysis. His writings speak to the need for balance, the wisdom to know when to pause and reflect, and the courage to move forward even when some uncertainty remains. Epictetus approached doubt from another angle. He noticed that hesitation often doesn't arise from external reality, but from internal narratives, quiet stories of self-doubt or imagined inadequacy. These aren't always rooted in fact, but in how the mind interprets and amplifies uncertainty. He encouraged a gentler approach, to recognize these inner barriers, to question them, not aggressively, but patiently. Rather than accept every hesitation as valid, he taught that we should examine where it comes from and whether it truly serves us. In modern life, this influence of doubt remains deeply present. We are faced with endless possibilities, career paths, relationships, personal changes, all accompanied by some level of uncertainty. Often, hesitation is mistaken for wisdom, appearing as careful caution. But when left unexamined, it can quietly limit movement and shrink possibility. Doors close, not loudly, but subtly, without notice. The Stoics remind us, uncertainty is natural, but waiting for perfect certainty can keep us stuck. Prolonged indecision doesn't bring clarity, it only extends confusion. It feeds anxiety rather than resolving it. Marcus Aurelius met this inner tension with daily reflection. He didn't strive to eliminate uncertainty. He understood that life would never offer total assurance. Instead, he focused on moving forward with thoughtful intention, trusting that calm action, not perfect knowledge, would shape a meaningful life. Clarity, in the Stoic sense, is not the absence of doubt. It is the presence of awareness, a quiet recognition of what we can control, and a willingness to act despite what we cannot. And in this, we find freedom, not from uncertainty, but from being ruled by it. The Stoics understood something quietly profound, that action taken amidst uncertainty often brings greater peace than a life held in indecision. Seneca spoke of this balance, of discernment paired with timely movement. He cautioned that the cost of missed opportunities often outweighs the risks of stepping forward. For him, decisiveness didn't mean recklessness. It meant thoughtful action, guided by awareness rather than fear. The Stoics never viewed decisiveness as impulsive or brash. They saw it as measured, intentional, born not of urgency, but of inner clarity. They encouraged gentle self-awareness, noticing when hesitation arises, questioning whether it's rooted in wisdom or in imagined inadequacy, and slowly, through reflection, guiding the mind toward forward motion. Epictetus spoke directly to this. He taught that doubt itself is not the problem, it's how we relate to it. He invited his students to observe their inner narratives, to distinguish genuine caution from the quiet voices of fear or self-limiting belief. In doing so, they could reshape perception, not by denying uncertainty, but by learning to move through it with steadiness. For the Stoics, doubt wasn't something to eliminate, it was something to understand. A natural part of decision-making that becomes less disruptive when held with awareness. Through this inner discipline, the grip of hesitation weakens. Possibilities become clearer, and action becomes not a reaction, but a choice. This is how we move forward, not by waiting for certainty, but by acting with intention despite its absence. Because in the end, actions shape us more than intentions ever could. Marcus Aurelius reflected often on this truth. He reminded himself that a person is not defined by what they plan, hope, or say, but by what they consistently do. He saw how easy it is to imagine discipline, to speak of virtue, to promise change, and yet never fully embody it. For him, self-respect was earned quietly, through the steady alignment of actions with values, not through performance, but through integrity. Seneca expanded on this idea. He understood that virtue is not proven in the abstract. It is revealed in the way we meet daily life, in our decisions, our habits, our treatment of others, not in the thoughts we keep, but in the life we live. Seneca reflected deeply on this familiar pattern, how often we convince ourselves of our own resolve while quietly delaying real effort. He observed that intentions offer comfort. They make us feel as though we've already taken a step, when in truth, we're still standing still. He warned of a subtle self-deception, mistaking the recognition of the right path for actually walking it. For Seneca, the only real measure of growth wasn't found in what we hope to do, but in what we actually choose to do. Discipline, integrity, personal transformation, these aren't born from abstract ideas. They're built, one action at a time, through quiet, repeated commitment to our values. Epictetus offered the same truth, but with a particular clarity. To him, self-trust wasn't something we could talk ourselves into. It wasn't built through affirmations or hopeful thinking. It came from consistency, from doing what we say we'll do, from living in alignment with our deeper intentions, even when it's difficult, even when no one is watching. He understood that every time we fail to follow through on what we told ourselves mattered, something inside us weakens. And every time we act in integrity, no matter how small the step, we strengthen a foundation of trust within ourselves. In the modern world, this remains as true as ever. It's easy to plan, to imagine better routines, greater focus, improved discipline. But intention alone isn't what creates change. The Stoics remind us, transformation doesn't wait for perfect timing. It begins the moment we begin, even if that beginning feels small. Marcus Aurelius noticed how the mind often offers reasons to delay, how excuses can dress themselves in logic. But he returned to a simple truth again and again. Life is already happening, and there is no moment more suitable for action than the one you're standing in now. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself often that no moment is more valuable than the present. Seneca reinforced this, warning against the illusion of endless time. He understood that hesitation doesn't just cost us opportunity, it quietly steals life itself. Epictetus was direct and uncompromising. Self-respect is built one action at a time. Without action, even the noblest thoughts remain empty. The Stoics did not believe in sudden transformation, but in steady refinement through daily practice. Trust in oneself is not given. It is earned, moment by moment, through the choice to act rather than to delay. In time, a person becomes what they consistently do, not what they hope or promise. And through these small, deliberate acts, the foundation of true self-respect is quietly laid. The Stoics also cautioned against relying on external rescue, not because help is never available, but because waiting for it surrenders the agency to shape one's own life. Marcus Aurelius reflected deeply on this truth, reminding himself that no one else is responsible for his character, his choices, or his resilience. Only he is. Fortune may shift, and others may offer assistance, but true strength always springs from within. To depend on external circumstances for change is to hand over control to forces that are unpredictable, indifferent, and ever-changing. Waiting for someone or something to intervene isn't just a pause in action. It's a quiet surrender of one's own potential. Seneca saw this clearly. He observed how people often place their hopes on external events, a better opportunity, a stroke of luck, the right guidance, believing these will transform their lives. Yet he warned against this passive mindset, recognizing it as a subtle abdication of responsibility. To Seneca, the only real path to improvement is deliberate effort, not wishful thinking. Those who wait for perfect conditions often find themselves waiting indefinitely, trapped by the expectation that life will provide clarity before action is required. Epictetus knew this truth intimately. Born into slavery, he faced harsh external realities few could imagine. Yet he refused to see himself as a victim of fate. His philosophy was rooted in the firm conviction that, while we may not control our circumstances, we always control how we respond to them. He taught that looking inward, to one's own mind and choices, is the true source of freedom. Relying on others for salvation, whether through validation, guidance, or opportunity, is, according to the Stoics, a quiet surrender of one's own power to define their path. Strength, they insisted, is not given. It is built, shaped through discipline, through deliberate action, and through the refusal to wait passively for a life that must be created. This perspective remains deeply relevant in our modern world, full of distractions and endless comparisons. It's easy to believe that change will come from an external shift, a new job, a different relationship, or more favorable circumstances. Yet the Stoics remind us that true transformation is not the product of conditions, but of decisions. Marcus Aurelius understood that waiting for inspiration, for the perfect moment, or for an external push is often just another form of delay. Seneca reminded himself that no one arrives with the life we imagine. It comes only through our own action. Epictetus lived this truth, showing that self-reliance does not mean isolation, but rather a refusal to place one's fate entirely in the hands of others. The Stoics did not reject help when it is offered, nor did they believe in a harsh independence that denies human connection. Instead, they emphasized that waiting passively for change is to waste what is always within reach, the power of choice. Strength is forged not in moments of ease, but in the ongoing decision to act despite difficulty. Every moment offers an opportunity to take responsibility, to stop seeking permission from the outside world, and to move forward with purpose. The path is always open, not waiting to be given, but waiting to be taken. Change brings discomfort, yes, but remaining unchanged carries a far deeper burden. The Stoics understood this tension not as an abstract idea, but as a fundamental truth of human experience. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on the nature of growth, reminding himself that transformation rarely comes without struggle, yet stagnation brings its own quiet suffering. He saw that resisting change does not protect us. Instead, it prolongs discomfort, trapping the mind in a loop of hesitation. To avoid change is not to find safety, but to remain stuck, burdened by what no longer serves us. Seneca observed a similar reality. He noted how people often endure deep unhappiness simply because it's familiar. The discomfort of staying in a limiting situation in some ways feels easier than facing the uncertainty of the unknown. Fear of transition keeps many tethered to situations that no longer reflect their true potential. Yet Seneca argued that while change can be difficult, refusing to evolve leads to a quieter, more persistent suffering, one that lingers beneath the surface and grows heavier with time. Epictetus understood this deeply, having lived through circumstances far beyond his control. He saw that adaptation isn't optional, it's necessary. Resisting transformation only intensifies hardship. But embracing it, even gradually, allows movement towards something better. He did not deny the discomfort that comes with change. Instead, he recognized that the pain of remaining the same is often far greater. His teachings invite us to see transition not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a chance to refine our character and shape our circumstances, rather than be shaped by them. This perspective remains profoundly relevant today. In modern life, the tendency to avoid discomfort often leads to prolonged dissatisfaction. A career that no longer inspires, a routine that no longer fulfills, a way of thinking that no longer serves. Yet fear of the unknown keeps many rooted, hoping that change will somehow become easier with time. The Stoics remind us that this waiting is an illusion. Growth does not come when fear disappears. It comes when action is taken despite it. Marcus Aurelius practiced this mindset daily, reminding himself that hesitation only prolongs suffering. Seneca challenged the belief that one must feel completely ready before moving forward, knowing that waiting for certainty often leads only to inaction. The Stoics understood that transformation isn't about avoiding discomfort, but about embracing the process of becoming. They trusted that the temporary unease of change is far lighter than the lasting burden of stagnation. They never dismissed the reality of fear, nor suggested that change should be forced or rushed. Instead, they encouraged a thoughtful approach, one that acknowledges discomfort yet refuses to be frozen by it. Transition, they taught, is a necessary part of a meaningful life. It is not something to resist, but something to engage with intentionally. In stepping forward, even when uncertainty remains, there is freedom, not just movement but growth. Complaint offers momentary relief, but quietly reinforces a sense of powerlessness. Marcus Aurelius saw this clearly, not as a moral failing, but as an ineffective way of engaging with reality. He often reflected on how dwelling on misfortune or injustice accomplishes little beyond deepening frustration. Lamenting circumstances changes nothing. Action, no matter how small, creates movement. He reminded himself repeatedly that external events have no true authority over one's inner state unless permission is granted. To focus on grievances is to surrender agency. To direct attention toward what can be shaped is to reclaim it. Seneca observed how habitual complaint traps people in a cycle of discontent. Those who dwell on misfortune often deepen their own suffering, not because hardship is unbearable, but because their focus remains fixed on what lies beyond their control. He saw clearly that adversity, though inevitable, becomes heavier through resistance. Complaint, he argued, is less about the external world and more about one's internal perspective, the choice to fixate on obstacles or to navigate them. He encouraged shifting energy away from lamentation toward deliberate response, recognizing that every challenge carries the opportunity to act with clarity and resolve. Epictetus approached this idea with his characteristic directness. He understood that dwelling on what is unfair, unjust, or beyond reach is to hand over control to circumstance. He saw that complaints do not change the external world, but they do shape the individual, diminishing resilience, reinforcing helplessness, and distracting from what remains possible. For Epictetus, the key was not to ignore difficulties, but to engage with them thoughtfully turning attention toward what can be done, rather than lingering on what cannot, is a timeless insight that feels especially relevant in a world often fueled by outrage and frustration. Modern life offers no shortage of reasons to complain: social injustices, personal setbacks, daily annoyances. Yet the Stoics remind us that a constant focus on grievances only prolongs distress. Complaints may invite sympathy or validation, but they rarely lead to solutions. What truly changes circumstances, or at least shifts our experience of them, is action. Marcus Aurelius returned to this truth again and again. He understood that peace does not come from demanding a different reality, but from fully engaging with the one that exists. Seneca urged his readers to notice how much energy is wasted in resentment, energy that could be better spent in meaningful effort. Epictetus, unwavering in his philosophy, saw every moment spent complaining as a moment lost, one that could have been used to build, to adapt, to move forward. The Stoics did not advocate passive acceptance of hardship, nor did they suggest ignoring injustice. Rather, they proposed a shift in perspective, away from resentment and toward response, away from blame and toward responsibility. They recognized that while hardship often lies beyond our control, the way we meet it remains a choice. And within that choice lies the difference between frustration and resilience, stagnation and progress. When left undisciplined, the mind becomes its own master, dictating emotions, reactions, and perceptions without restraint. The Stoics understood that true freedom is not found in external circumstances, but in the ability to govern one's own thoughts. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this constantly, recognizing how easily an untrained mind succumbs to impulses, anxieties, and fleeting emotions. He observed that without deliberate attention, thoughts take control, leading to unnecessary suffering, exaggerated fears, and misplaced priorities. To him, mastery over the mind was not suppression, but guidance, training the inner world to respond with clarity rather than react impulsively to external events. Seneca emphasized this as well. He noted that without self-discipline, the mind is at the mercy of whatever forces pull at it: desires, frustrations, fears, and external influences. He observed how often people seek control over external matters, while neglecting the one thing truly within their grasp, their own perception. People often allow the mind to wander unchecked, handing over authority to every passing thought and external pressure. Seneca saw self-discipline not as a restriction, but as a form of internal liberation, a way to shape experience rather than be shaped by it. Epictetus, whose philosophy was forged through personal hardship, viewed mental discipline as the foundation of resilience. He understood that without conscious control, the mind becomes a source of instability, reacting to every perceived slight, every moment of discomfort, every imagined threat. He taught that true strength lies in the ability to observe thoughts without immediately identifying with them, to pause before reacting, and to choose responses with intention rather than impulse. For Epictetus, mastery over the mind was not about forcefully resisting emotions, but about cultivating enough awareness to recognize them as transient, passing phenomena, ultimately within one's power to manage. This insight feels profoundly relevant in our modern world, where distractions are constant, emotions are easily triggered, and external pressures demand immediate responses. The Stoics remind us that without careful attention, the mind can dictate experience, rather than serve as a tool to navigate it. A person who does not master their own thoughts often finds themselves pulled in every direction, reacting to circumstances rather than shaping them, feeling at the mercy of emotions instead of engaging with them intentionally. Marcus Aurelius practiced this discipline through steady observation of his own thought patterns, questioning whether they served him or led him toward unnecessary distress. Seneca similarly emphasized reflection as a method of refining perception, reminding himself that most frustrations arise, not from events themselves, but from how they are interpreted. Epictetus taught with his characteristic directness that the properly trained mind becomes a source of stability, allowing a person to engage with the world from strength rather than reactivity. The Stoics did not see self-discipline as suppression, nor did they advocate detachment from emotion. Instead, they proposed awareness, the ability to notice thoughts without becoming controlled by them, to respond rather than react. They understood that when left unchecked, the mind can create suffering where none need exist. But when guided patiently and with clarity, it becomes the foundation of resilience, equanimity, and genuine freedom. Trust, they recognized, is not something to be claimed. It must be demonstrated first to oneself, then to others. Marcus Aurelius reflected often on the idea that self-respect is earned through the quiet fulfillment of one's own commitments. He observed how easily people make promises to themselves, vows to change, to improve, to act with discipline, yet fail to follow through. To him, this internal inconsistency was more damaging than external failure, for it eroded the very foundation upon which self-trust is built. Seneca explored this further, noting that a person who repeatedly breaks their own commitments gradually loses confidence in themselves. Trust, he understood, is not merely an agreement between individuals, but a deeply personal, unspoken contract with oneself. Each time an intention is abandoned, each time an excuse replaces effort, this internal trust weakens. Seneca did not advocate harsh self-judgment, but rather honest acknowledgement of how one's actions align with one's values. He believed true confidence arises not from external validation, but from the quiet knowledge that one does what they say they will do. Epictetus, ever direct in his philosophy, framed trust as a matter of character rather than reputation. He understood that external recognition means little if a person cannot rely on themselves in moments of challenge. He saw clearly that self-respect is forged through discipline, the Stoics taught, is built not through occasional grand gestures, but through small, consistent acts of integrity. To Epictetus, a person who keeps their word, especially to themselves, develops an inner strength that no external circumstance can shake. He urged his students to focus not on appearing trustworthy to others, but on becoming the kind of person who never needs to question their own reliability. This teaching feels especially relevant today, in a world filled with distractions and fleeting commitments. It's easy to set intentions without following through, to make promises that quickly fade. Yet the Stoics remind us that true confidence does not come from external praise or recognition. It comes from the steady, disciplined practice of aligning actions with principles. Trust is not a claim to be made, it is a foundation to be built, through decisions made when no one is watching, through efforts sustained even when motivation wanes. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that self-discipline is not about control, but about consistency, proving again and again to oneself that intentions are matched with action. Seneca encouraged a life where commitments, no matter how small, are honored, knowing that each fulfilled promise strengthens character. Epictetus understood that external circumstances will always change, but the ability to trust in one's own actions remains the only true source of stability. The Stoics did not see trust as something to be demanded, but as something to be cultivated. They recognized that true self-respect is not born of perfection, but of persistence. Each day offers an opportunity to reinforce this foundation, not through grand declarations, but through quiet, deliberate choices. And in these choices, one becomes the kind of person they can rely on, creating an inner steadiness no external force can take away. The Stoics did not promise an easy path, nor did they offer a formula for eliminating struggle. What they offered was something far more valuable, a way of seeing, a way of engaging with life rooted in clarity rather than illusion, in responsibility rather than reliance, in action rather than hesitation. They understood that mastery of the mind is not about perfect control, but about cultivating awareness, shaping perception, and aligning action with principle. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that external events will always be uncertain, but the ability to meet them with steadiness remains within reach. Seneca observed how easily people drift through life, waiting for change to arrive instead of creating it themselves. Epictetus, with unwavering clarity, saw that freedom is not granted by the world, but earned through self-discipline and thoughtful response. Each of them, in their own way, recognized that life does not owe us certainty, fairness, or ease. But it does offer us the opportunity, in every moment, to choose how we engage with what is before us. The mind, if left unexamined, dictates experience rather than refines it. Fear becomes a guide instead of an obstacle when met with understanding. Doubt loses its hold when action is taken despite its presence. Complaints dissolve when attention shifts from what is lacking to what can be done. Trust in oneself is not something granted, but something built, through consistency, through discipline, through the daily practice of aligning thoughts, words, and actions. The Stoics did not seek a life free from hardship. They sought to cultivate the strength to move through it without being diminished by it. Their wisdom is not a call to detachment nor a denial of emotion. It is an invitation to live fully, with presence, resilience, and an unwavering commitment. The focus is always on what lies within our control. So the question is never whether challenges will come. They inevitably will. The true question is how we choose to meet them. Within that choice lies the difference between being shaped by circumstances and shaping ourselves through them. The path will never be free of obstacles. Yet for those willing to engage fully, every challenge becomes an opportunity to refine the mind, strengthen character, and build a life guided by intention rather than reaction. The work is ongoing, never complete, but neither is our potential for growth. And in that space between what happens and how we respond, that is where true freedom is found. Subscribe to Stoic Mindset Mastery